So President Trump says he wants to pull all U.S. troops out of Germany, while at the same time, a recent poll suggests that a majority of Germans view the United States as a major threat to world peace. I mean, think about that for a second. For decades, the U.S. military presence in Germany represented protection, stability, partnership. But now, many Germans don't view it that way anymore. And many Americans are wondering, why are we still in Germany anyway? So I spent 30 years in the U.S. military, and many of those years right here in Germany. I've seen this relationship evolve over the decades, and I know that many Americans and some Germans don't quite understand the nature of this relationship, and they don't appreciate the cost involved if all U.S. forces were to leave Germany. Here's how I see the situation. All right, so how did we get here? Although he receives a lot of the blame or a lot of the credit, depending on which side of this topic you stand on, I want to point out that this whole discussion didn't just start because Donald Trump got upset with Friedrich Merz a couple weeks ago. The withdrawal of U.S. troops from Germany or from all throughout Europe has been discussed by every presidential administration since the end of the Cold War. And I believe it was during the Obama administration in which the term pivot to the Pacific was coined. And that was referring to the belief that the United States needed to shift its focus from Europe to Asia and the Pacific. And personally, I remember during the George W. Bush administration, I attended a briefing by the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, and he said, and this was over 20 years ago, and he said that the only reason we still had troops in Germany or in Europe was simply because we didn't have any other place to put them. So this is not a new topic. So at one point, there were hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops stationed in West Germany. And, the divided Germany was literally the front line on the Cold War. But the Cold War ended about 35 years ago. And the American presence has been reduced significantly. Right now, there's about 35,000 troops stationed in Germany. But we still maintain enormous infrastructure here, huge training areas, bases, schools, housing areas, medical facilities, logistics centers, airfields, basically entire American communities. And all of that kind of brings up the question, does the current structure of U.S. forces in Germany still make sense today? So maintaining military bases overseas is incredibly expensive, but something that many Americans either don't realize or they just choose to ignore is that the United States does not pay for everything. I mean, Germany contributes billions of euros in direct support to the U.S. military presence here. That includes infrastructure support, construction, utilities, land use agreements, and other host nation support arrangements. Now, obviously, the U.S. still spends an enormous amount of money here too, but the idea that some Americans have that Germany contributes nothing is simply not true. But of course, from the American perspective, maintaining large, permanent overseas communities is incredibly expensive, especially when you station not just the troops, but their families overseas. Like I said, all of the things that we basically have small American communities in foreign countries. And strategically, as much as it hurts me to admit it, I don't really believe we benefit from all of that. Not anymore, anyway. And sometimes I really think that we oversimplify the cost argument. So yes, maintaining forces overseas is expensive, but is it really that much more expensive than having these bases in the United States? I mean, and if you think about it, if you take Ramstein Air Base here in Germany, if it didn't exist, the U.S. military would still want or need a massive global air mobility hub somewhere, on this side of the Atlantic. We'd still need runways. We'd still need fuel infrastructure, maintenance facilities, warehouses, housing, medical support, personnel. And those costs don't magically disappear if you just move everything back to the United States. But still, if you moved it all back to the United States, we would still need something on this side of the Atlantic. So I'm not sure if we're solving the problem just if we pulled everyone out of Germany. And so I think that Germany is probably more cost effective than a lot of people realize, because so much of the infrastructure is already built and integrated into NATO operations. And like I said previously, Germany contributes billions of euros in host nation support through infrastructure, land agreements, and things like that. So I think the real debate is not, does overseas basing cost a lot of money? I mean, the answer is, of course, obviously it does. I think the real question is, does the strategic value justify the additional costs associated with having forces forward deployed in Europe? All right, so I believe that the current arrangement needs to be changed, but I strongly disagree with people who just say simply, just close all the bases and bring everybody home. It's not that simple. Facilities like, again, let's look at Ramstein Air Base. It's not really here to defend Germany. I mean, does Germany receive some defensive advantages because the U.S. military has bases here? Sure it does. Absolutely it does. But that's not the main reason we have bases here. I mean, that reason ended 35 years ago when the Cold War ended. So Ramstein is one of the most important logistics and transit hubs that the U.S. military has anywhere in the world. Operations throughout Europe, Africa, the Middle East, they all rely heavily on infrastructure in Germany. Ramstein is truly a global hub, not just a German or a European hub. And replacing that capability somewhere else would take years and cost an enormous amount of money. And if we close Landstuhl Medical Center, where will we send our wounded troops from Africa or the Middle East? I worked at Landstuhl for a couple years during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and I can tell you that every day, sometimes multiple times per day, we would receive injured troops from those conflicts. They would come in and we would receive them at Landstuhl Hospital. So if we close that hospital just because we want to pull troops out of Germany, where are we going to send them to? And by the way, speaking of Landstuhl, its replacement is being built right now. There's the brand new Rhine Ordnance Barracks Medical Center, and this is a multi-billion-dollar investment that isn't even fully operational yet. So walking away from projects like that would be an unbelievable waste of taxpayer money. All right, now let's talk about the part that I think many Americans don't realize. And that is that German attitudes toward the United States government, and toward our military bases here in Germany have changed dramatically over the years. Recent polling shows that around 65% of Germans now view the United States as a major threat to global peace. I mean, let that sink in for a second. So according to those polls, more Germans view the United States as a bigger threat to world peace than China. And we're about equal with Russia in those polls. So higher than China and about the same as Russia. I mean, 20 years ago, that would have been unthinkable. And whether those polls are really accurate or not, the fact of the matter is that a lot of Germans see the United States as a threat to world peace. All right, so why the shift in attitude? Well, I think it's because the younger generation, they don't remember the Cold War. They don't remember the Berlin airlift. They know the United States more for its Middle East conflicts, which have had a huge impact on German society. and more for recent blunt threats to take over the territory of one of its neighbors. I mean, when they hear the U.S. government talking about taking Greenland or obtaining it the hard way, I mean, that doesn't sound like the language of an ally. It sounds like the language of an aggressive enemy. To them, or to many of them, I should say, these bases aren't really symbols of a shared defense. For many people, they're increasingly seen as symbols of a foreign intervention, global power projection, or simply a leftover relic of another era. And for my fellow Americans who feel that Germans, or really all Europeans, owe us a debt for World War II and World War I guess, I certainly understand that way of thinking, and I do agree to a certain extent. But I mean, World War II was over 80 years ago, right? And so by that way of thinking that they still owe us a debt of gratitude for World War II, I mean, I guess we should still be very thankful to France for helping us during the Revolutionary War. I mean, so when was the last time you, my fellow Americans, thanked a Frenchman for helping us out, for helping us to get our independence from the United Kingdom during the Revolutionary War? I mean, I never have. Have you? All right, and then there's the political reality inside Germany itself. So the right-wing Alternative für Deutschland, or AfD, Alternative for Germany, we'd say in English, is a political party, and it's currently polling extremely strong in many parts of Germany. And I've heard some people kind of compare it as like the German version of MAGA in a way. They seem to have very similar goals in some ways. But so the AfD has called for a complete withdrawal of U.S. forces. So you've got a political party that's surging in polls, and they're saying they want all U.S. forces out of Germany, right? So the important point is this, people have said that, for, I guess, years, decades, but calls for reducing or even fully withdrawing U.S. troops from Germany, they're no longer some fringe political position. These ideas are increasingly entering mainstream political discussion. All right, so who actually wants the American military bases to stay in Germany? And this is something that I've observed over the years in kind of my own anecdotal research, if you will. But you speak to a lot of you speak to older Germans who maybe grew up around American military bases, and a lot of them have fond memories. They talk about the great times they've spent with Americans and how much fun it was having them around. But that generation, unfortunately, they're getting older, and there's not as many of them around as there used to be. So it seems like today, and this is not the entire case, but it seems like the group of people who really want American forces to stay and the American military bases to stay open are really the people who benefit personally from the bases being here. I'm talking about Germans who work on U.S. military bases, businesses that cater heavily to Americans, and property owners who rent almost exclusively to Americans. Europe remains critically important to the United States economically and strategically. I mean, the European Union is one of America's largest trading partners, and so a stable Europe is clearly in America's interest. So personally, I think the future probably looks like a smaller but more flexible American presence, more rotational deployments, fewer permanent family assignments, less Cold War era infrastructure, but maintaining key strategic hubs and NATO integration. And from the German perspective, I'm honestly not sure what the best answer is. Complete withdrawal of U.S. forces would certainly have a major economic impact on communities that have spent generations building themselves around the American military presence. Entire local economies have adapted to support the U.S. bases and military families. There's no question that some towns would feel that loss very deeply. But at the same time, this has already happened in other parts of Germany. Bases have closed before, communities adjusted, adapted, and ultimately survived. And I do wonder if, from the German perspective, there's an argument that a clear long-term decision might actually be better than living under the constant uncertainty and repeated political threats of withdrawal every few years. Because uncertainty makes long-term planning almost impossible, both economically and politically. So even though a withdrawal would absolutely be painful in the short term, some Germans may eventually decide they would rather fully move on than continue existing in this permanent state of strategic uncertainty. So, those are my thoughts as someone who spent 3 decades serving in the U.S. military and many years living here in Germany. And so I know this is a sensitive topic, and I certainly know that not everyone's going to agree with me. But I do think it's a discussion worth having, without slogans, without propaganda, and without pretending that things haven't changed. So let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.